Amatakyapi. This is Nick Estes here with the Red Nation Podcast. I have a special episode today talking about the recent UN report that was issued, I believe, on September 15th, 2025, excuse me, September 16th, 2025. Today is Thursday, September 18th, so some things might have changed. But nonetheless, I wanted to just give an overview of this report because I think it's really historic. I think there's a lot in the report that is worth considering. I'll offer some analysis and some criticisms that I have, given the fact that the United Nations has either, it's proved either unwilling or incapable of actually stopping this genocide, and nonetheless calls upon states in the world to intervene. And we can talk a little bit about what those mean, but what those interventions might mean. But for now, let's just delve right into the report. I'm sure if you haven't already, you can find this online. I'll link it in the show notes so that you can get a copy. But basically, I'll just give a summary and then delve into some of the points in this report. So this is a report that was issued by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestine Territory, or known by the acronym, I guess, as OPT, which includes East Jerusalem and Israel, or the occupied 48 territories, which was mandated in May of 2021 to investigate violations of humanitarian and human rights law. And since the beginning of the genocide, or at least the intensification of the genocide following the begin of Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th, 2023, this commission has issued several or published several reports documenting Israeli military conduct in Gaza. These early reports concluded that Israel's committed multiple crimes against humanity and war crimes. But this report, documents extermination, torture, rape, sexual violence, starvation. So just a heads up, I will be talking a little bit about some of these really highly sensitive and horrific details. If you're like me, I get a lot of news from alternative news sources, but if you have an internet connection and a phone, I'm sure that you've witnessed some sort of atrocity that Israel has committed against Palestinians in Gaza. So you can use, you can use your phone to look these things up. Many of them are verifiable. I actually listened to an interview with one of the writers of this particular report. In the interviewer was criticizing this UN official for not actually being on the ground in Gaza, for not, collecting this data firsthand. And he kind of shot back by saying, well, we have UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency that was operating, providing humanitarian relief and aid in Gaza for many years, which was recently, banished or banned by the state of Israel. The state of Israel, in cooperation or in collaboration with the United States, set up the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is now kind of taken over humanitarian relief duties in Gaza. Suffice it to say, the UN official was sort of commenting and pushing back and saying, well, actually, we do have people on the ground there. But then also said that, the majority, or not the majority, but many of the facts that they had been gathered through social media posts, but also using WhatsApp and Zoom interviews to talk directly with people in Gaza. As I'm recording, the Israeli military has, began one of its many ground campaigns into Gaza City, and now, as far as I know, the internet has been cut off. So we're not getting any reports coming from that area, other than secondhand reports, saying that bombing has intensified. In some instances, more so than any part of this genocidal war. To return back to this report, because I think it's important, this report finds in its summary or executive summary that Israeli authorities have destroyed the reproductive capacity of Palestinians in Gaza, deliberately inflicted conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction. These acts are recognized, obviously, as genocide under the Rome Statute and the Genocide Convention. The report specifically addresses the issue of genocide in Gaza, covering, just the periods from the 7th of October 2023 to July 31st in 2025. Obviously, since we're in September, the end of September, so there's a whole other it's like at least 6 weeks or more of atrocities that have been committed since then. But the report is also just limited geographically to Gaza. It doesn't include the West Bank or even the occupied territories. And it's also sort of temporally confined to that particular time period. The report also references the current case in the International Criminal Court of Justice, or an International Court of Justice brought by South Africa. That was in, I think, if I'm recalling correctly, that was in 2023, in December 2023, or was it 2023 or the early January 2024? I can't remember. It's been, we're going on 2 years of this genocide. I apologize for the dates, everyone. But the commission, aims to establish whether the acts committed by Israeli authorities constitute genocide and set out the obligations of both Israel and third states, which can include the rest of the world. Insofar as we know, there's only one state that is actively working to prevent or intervening to prevent the genocide using military or kinetic force, and that is Yemen. And we can see the ways in which that nation and that state has been criminalized and also has survived its own genocide at the hands of the U.S.-backed, an Israeli-backed Saudi regime in Saudi Arabia. But let's talk a little bit about genocide, because this is a word that gets bandied about a lot. And I just saw or heard, I don't know, I haven't verified this, but I heard that Senator Bernie Sanders is now using the word genocide, and he's refused to do so since the beginning of this escalation for whatever reason, to protect his own sort of investments in the Zionist project. One can only assume. But I think he also, in one interview, said that this requires legal expertise to understand genocide. That is partly true, but it's also, genocide is a very commonly understood framework. I mean, there are specificities within international law that sort of delineate what counts and what doesn't count as genocide. And I'll kind of jump into some later on. I'll jump into some of Israel's sort of defenses or counter arguments that it is committing genocide, and how the United States is actually alibying those claims. But I'll talk about that at the end in the conclusion and analysis. Just to kind of lay out the definitions of genocide. There's 5 categories for underlying acts that exist. It's killing members of a group. In this case, it's Palestinians, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm, inflicting conditions of life to bring about physical destruction, preventing births, and forcefully transferring children. Of those 5 categories, this report identifies Israel committing 4 of those sort of violations. It doesn't find that Israel has forcibly transferred children, which is kind of ironic, because later in the report, it acknowledges that Israel actively detains children, and in some instances tortures them. So I don't know how that doesn't qualify as forcibly transferring children, nor does it acknowledge the many minors, the hundreds of minors, Palestinian children who are detained within administrative detention, who are taken away from their families. So I guess incarceration, according to this report, does not count as forcibly transferring children. I don't know why that is. There was a strong justification for not really including it, other than they said that they couldn't find evidence while citing evidence. Regardless of that, each of these acts must be committed with some sort of intention or have a stated genocidal intent, which I think is a Latin phrase for dolus specialis. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Let's be honest, this report is really difficult to read. I'm having a hard time even summarizing it, because every time I read one of these instances, just the flood of images came back, in my mind, of what I've seen on social media and in my algorithm. I think more recently, there was this image of this young Palestinian girl who was on an operating table. Her intestines were literally falling out of her body. It was pretty horrific to see. I can't imagine what it's like to live through this kind of genocide. I just want to, acknowledge that with anyone who's listening, or who is, very sensitive to this stuff. Just, bear with me. But it's also important to bear witness to this, because this is an important historic moment in the history of humanity. We're living through one of the most sort of repressive and reactionary times. I think we're on the cusp of something that is be potentially extremely destructive. It already is in many ways, but it also could be incredibly transformative for the better. But that's a question I don't know if I can answer here yet. But I will try to maybe offer some analysis in that regard. It's important to point out that there are legal implications for this particular report. It emphasizes that genocide entails both criminal responsibility, punishable under universal jurisdiction, and state responsibility, where organs of the state commit or fail to prevent genocidal acts. Universal jurisdiction, that means that people can be brought before international criminal courts, or potentially within domestic courts as well. So let's jump into this report. Let's jump into some of the sort of more detailed sort of examples that it gives in terms of identifying the genocide. And I'll just jump to probably one that many have heard of, and that is the murder of Hind Rajab child. I'll just jump forward to that really quick. This is a section that was documenting the instances in which the Israeli military was targeting Palestinians along evacuation routes and safe zones that were designated as evacuation routes and safe zones. And it details the very horrific killing of 5 children near the Ferris gas station at the Tel Al Hawa neighborhood in Gaza City, which happened on 29 January 2024. 2 adults were killed, Bashar Hamada Hamuda and Inam Mohammed Hamada, by Israeli security forces while driving their car with 5 children, which was 4 girls and 1 boy, including a 15-year-old Leon Hamada and her 5-year-old cousin Hind Rajab. The family's car was targeted by shots from guns, which were probably mounted from a tank. They killed Leon's parents and her 3 other siblings, leaving Leon and Hind injured in this car. There's recordings of them calling people and asking for help. Leon was killed, by shots, as well as later on, Hind died probably about 7 hours later after her cousin was killed, or sorry, her aunt and uncle were killed. So a pretty horrific scene there, and of course, those of you who followed the encampments protesting the genocide across college campuses, of course, we remember the Columbia students who renamed one of the buildings Hind Hall in honor of Hind Rajab, and all Palestinian children killed. And that is a very kind of stark detail in this particular report that was really difficult to read. Lots of children, were killed, and it's really difficult. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a hard time talking about it. It's a little bit difficult to really go over, and read these numbers, because these are not just numbers. These are people's children. Palestinians don't love their children any more than other parents or families in the world. So put yourself in that situation. Losing a child is, in our culture, is probably one of the hardest things that anyone would ever have to go through in their life. It's one of the 4 deaths that we as Lakota people talk about as being very traumatic and difficult. Actually, I think it is the number one. Is the number one death that is really hard for people to overcome. And this is, this goes back to how our children, for a century and a half, were taken from us. So in some instances are still taken from us. But in the sense of putting them into boarding schools, which many of them did die there, but also the current sort of transfer of children, taking them into social services and putting them into foster care or adopting out to white families. This, however, the situation in Gaza is drastically different in terms of just the sheer number of children who have been killed and disappeared. The details in this report by medical professionals, one doctor said that 50% of the patients he sees on his operating table are children. Thousands of amputees. I think one statistic read about 4,500 amputees, of many of them children. I think it was like 800 of them were children. So we're talking about an entire generation of children that have been traumatized, if not disappeared. And of course, women and children making up around 60% of the actual casualty rates. And according to Israel's own numbers, the number of Hamas militants it has Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants it has determined that it has killed or eliminated is about 8,500, I think it was. And so when you compare that to the reported deaths, which is around 60,000, it's nowhere near the actual deaths caused by this genocidal war. But nonetheless, it's that means that around like 80% of the deaths that are identifiable or quote unquote official, and I'm using scare quotes because this stuff is, there's the fog of war, but also there's even within this report, a refusal to actually acknowledge other sort of estimates of death. I mean, they do talk about how the conditions of war imposed on of a genocidal war imposed on Palestinian civilians will result in deaths that are not necessarily military related, but nonetheless, even taking that sort of calculation into account, like 80% or more of the deaths in this genocide are civilian, and that is something that is not acknowledged and accepted. And I'll get to why that's important. Why that's important not only for this report to acknowledge, but why it's important for the Israeli officials and the U.S. officials to acknowledge this high civilian death toll, because this is not just about a war. This isn't about two sort of militaries kind of fielding their forces on the field of battle. This is very obviously a genocide. It doesn't. I mean, you can say that as many times as you want. It doesn't. It doesn't change the reality on the ground. You can say this is a war. You can say these are military targets many times as you want, but anyone with the internet connection and a phone can see otherwise. That the consequences to this are quite extreme. I'm going to turn to just a quick quote from the so-called Golani brigades. And this is a report that comes from a YouTube video about the Golani unit, which is considered special forces or an elite unit. The conduct of the Golani unit on 23 March 2025 was consistent with instructions given by one of its commanders on 4 April 2025, when he told soldiers, quote, "Everyone you encounter is an enemy. If you see a figure, open fire, neutralize the threat, keep moving, do not hesitate, do not second guess." This comes in the context of how the military doesn't distinguish between, medical personnel who are treating people who, digging them out of the rubble of a building that was just bombed, responding to a call where, an Israeli missile or bomb just struck. And this is, the prerogative of soldiers is their orders to not distinguish who is an enemy, do not second guess, but just kill anything essentially that moves. It's a pretty obvious indication that this is more than just This is more than just a sort of traditional war. The other aspect of this is that these individuals were not, just targeted individually. In Rajab and her family and other Palestinians were not just targeted individually, but they are targeted collectively due to their identity as Palestinians. That's made very clear in this report. That targeting is not just collective targeting; it's also later on they talk about sort of collective terror, the mental and psychological damage it does to people, but also the long-term physical and mental health disabilities people live with as a result of surviving this particular genocide. And to kind of get into some of that, I mean, there's the death toll, but then this report is very clear, saying the number of deaths is not an indication of genocide, because the intent is to destroy in whole or in part. And I think a lot of people leave out that in part that it's not just if a body count hits a certain number that it qualifies as a genocide. There has to be intent. There has to be sort of a pre-planning, like a planned sort of execution of these things. And we can see that happening in this instance. This report claims that, as of July 30th, 2025, that the number of persons injured in Gaza is around 146,269 people, with upwards to 4,000 limb amputations. The total number of children injured is about 34,000. Obviously, these numbers, I don't know. I know where they're getting them from, but I don't know how accurate they are. In October 2024, the Commission of Human Rights actually reported that Gaza is home to the largest cohort of child amputees in modern history. So this is on, and I think this is something that was like even before October 7th in 2023. I always think about this because I remember reading these reports about how children who had survived these many Israeli air raids in Gaza were left as amputees and with psychological and physical disabilities that would be with them for the rest of their lives. And now seeing, the immense amount of death and destruction that these children are now living through. It was unfathomable then, and it's completely unfathomable now. There's also almost a complete destruction of all standing buildings in Gaza. Even these amputations that do happen, many of them happen without anesthesia because of the lack of medical supplies and the blockade implemented in the siege. It prevents medical supplies from getting in. Another sort of aspect of this that I found pretty nefarious, and there's many aspects, but the practice of capturing Palestinians and separating them, separating men and boys from their families during evacuations. These soldiers would then take these men and boys behind, out of sight of their family members, and then fire gunshots to make the family members believe that their relatives have been executed. Who thinks of this stuff? I don't even know. I don't even know where somebody would come up with that idea. What kind of person thinks of these kinds of things? This sort of collective punishment also relates to the targeting of people for sexual violence and rape. There were many instances in which detainees were raped or had instruments such as brooms, sometimes vegetables, shoved inside orifices in their bodies. We've seen actual video documentation of this at some of the Israeli prisons that are housing Palestinian detainees. And this really is fascinating because we're seeing systemic use of sexual violence and rape as a tool of genocide being documented in a UN report with actual witnesses, actual video evidence, contrary to the reports and the claims that Hamas and Palestinian resistance fighters had committed mass rapes against Israeli women. That has been proven false. And there has been no evidence to support these claims, but nonetheless, that was what the media had run with and what the media has still sort of portrayed. And the media isn't running with this particular story, isn't, flashing that across headlines or having expert panels on how Israelis are using mass rape as a tool of genocide and war. This practice, I'll read a little bit of it. I apologize for the details, but the commission, this Human Rights Commission, also received credible information concerning many cases of rape and sexual assault, including the use of an electrical probe to cause burns to the anus, and the insertion of objects such as sticks, broomsticks, and vegetables into the anus of detainees. Commission notes that female detainees were subjected to sexual assault and harassment in military and Israel prison service facilities, as well as threats to their lives and threats of rape. The sexual harassment included attempts to kiss and touch their breasts. They reported repeated, prolonged, and invasive strip searches, both before and after interrogations. Women were beaten and harassed and had sexual insults directed at them. Female detainees were photographed without their consent in degrading circumstances, including in their underwear in front of male soldiers. And these photographs were often posted to social media. There's a social media account called a Genocide Watch that has documented some instances in which Israeli soldiers go into Palestinians' home who have been forcibly displaced because of the war, and they dress themselves up in women's clothing. So, I think there's deeply gendered and sexual nature to this kind of violence that, isn't just sort of about digging through Palestinian women's underwear drawers and closets, but also results in actual sexual violence against Palestinians that has gone largely unaccounted for in the public domain. Of course, they talk about how living with the humiliation of surviving these acts has profound detrimental psychological impacts on people. Some of this I can, I think back to my own sort of studies on the genocide of indigenous people. Sexual abuse was actually a widespread tool used against both children and women, beginning largely in the fur trade, but also carrying on, through Indian child removal, the boarding school era, to the present, taking of children from families today. It's sexual violence is often used as a form of control that stays with somebody for the rest of their life. Typically, people just don't get over that. I will move on to the next topic. The other one is the sort of trauma that people experience because of, not just having constant bombing and gunfire around them, but also the multiple forced evacuations that they're forced to endure over and over again, being told to relocate. And now we're seeing, this happen in Gaza City, is being forcefully evacuated. Schools have been destroyed. Children are, I think if you think about heinousness, I always think about, the crimes against children. Obviously, crimes against Palestinian men and adults are also, worthy of condemnation. But there's this particular interest in destroying children and the sexual nature of, attacking Palestinian women that I think is worth digesting and sort of understanding in our analysis. But I also recommend that people read Muhammad Al-Kurd's Perfect Victims, because he talks a lot about how not only is, the Palestinian man not a mournable person, but also, the Palestinian resistance fighter, when people are no longer perfect victims, when they do fight back in self-defense, they're obviously, we have to swiftly condemn them. I'll get into that a little bit about what that means in terms of our current moment. But I want to move in finally. This is just a book of genocide. I mean, Justin Poder and I did a podcast called The Book of Genocide, where we looked at sort of the biblical justifications for the current genocide in Gaza, looking specifically at the book of Joshua. This report actually cites some of the findings that we have. It doesn't cite us, but it cites similar sort of conclusions that we've come to as as people who are looking at the underlying causes, and this kind of gets to the larger argument that I'm trying to make in this particular podcast. I'm just reading this because I think it's worth going through the litany of grievances and the immense amount of documentation. And I don't know if there's been a genocide in history that has been as documented as this particular genocide, which kind of speaks to our current political moment to not, stop it, or to have, a political class and a ruling class that is either unwilling or unable to stop it, or is, conditionally 100% pro-genocide. So I'll read some of these because they're worth understanding. So these are mostly related to the sort of biblical justifications. There are many justifications that kind of spell out the intent, but I just picked out these choice ones because it really underlies the kind of thesis that I'm trying to make here, which I'll get to shortly. These statements particularly don't distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians. On 7 October, Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to inflict mighty vengeance on all places, on all of the places in which Hamas is deployed, hiding, and operating in that wicked city. It's an important word, that wicked city. We will turn them into rubble. I say to the residents of Gaza, leave now, because we will operate forcefully everywhere. 2 days later, 9 October 2023, then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced the complete siege of Gaza, claiming that Israel was fighting human animals and Israel must act accordingly. On 13 October 2023, President Isaac Herzog stated, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians who are not aware and not involved, it is absolutely not true." So collapsing sort of guilt with civilians as legitimate targets. On 29 October, same year, Brigadier General David Bar Khalifa, commander of the 36th Armored Division, invoked divine intervention in a call for his soldiers to be guided by general vengeance in their military operation. In a handwritten letter to his soldiers, he said, "What has been will be no more. We shall go out to it, the enemy. In war, we shall pulverize every accursed plot of land from which it came. We shall destroy it in memory of it, and we shall not return it until it is annihilated. And God doth render vengeance to his adversaries, and doth make expiation for the land of his people. The Lord will give strength to his people, and he shall guard thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and forever. This is our war. Today is our turn. We are here." On 3 November 2023, the same year, Prime Minister Netanyahu published a letter to Israeli soldiers and commanders of the war, which he wrote, quote, "Remember what Amalek did to you. This is a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. We constantly remember the sites of the horrific massacre on the Shemat Torah Shabbat on October 7th, 2023. The descendants of Amalek, or the Amalekites, were enemies of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Samuel, God tells the Israelites, "Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So, these are direct references to this sort of more genocidal aspects of the Bible. Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, also joined soldiers yelling and chanting direct references to Amalek as they launched, their attacks on Gaza. So these are just some just to kind of emphasize this kind of biblical component. And I'm gonna stop there with the examples and just jump right into the legal consequences. As because these are definitely those examples are one of several of many that are considered incitements to genocide. I just think it's really ironic that not ironic, but it's very telling that they're using biblical references to make these justifications and calls for mass killing, citing these genocidal parts of the Bible where entire races of people were just wiped out and their entire livelihoods were uprooted. Whether that happened in history is subject to debate. Probably didn't happen, but nonetheless, it's been used. And if it didn't happen, it's actually kind of worse because it's somebody made it up to justify genocidal war. And it's hundreds of years later, it's now being used in this very this 21st century modern war. So there are legal consequences to this, specifically for Israel. This report just calls for the halting of arms transfer and military assistance or public cover enabling genocidal acts from states. I have a question about this because it's like, what about all the media in Western states that enabled and alibied and promoted these lies? What are the implications there? It doesn't really say much because it's more interested in the sort of legal consequences and normative, state theory or whatever, international theory. I don't know what that word is called, but so this is a pretty serious thing. I think if I remember correctly, I'll have Sina put up or if I remember to, I'll have Sina put up a video of the Israeli ambassador to the UN shredding the UN Charter.
So that you can see exactly what you are inflicting upon the UN Charter with this destructive vote. This is you are shredding the UN Charter with your own hands. Yes, that's what you're doing. Shredding the UN Charter. Shame on you. Thank you, Mr. President.
I don't know if that was supposed to be symbolic because that's actually what Israel has done anyways. It's just shredded the UN Charter. So now they're just being really explicit about it. I think it's quite, literal. They just don't care about international law. And this report kind of proves it, but it also begs the question of like, well, what are the enforcement mechanisms? Before we get to the enforcement mechanisms, we also have to talk about third-party states. The United States is definitely, it's considered a third-party state. I would actually say it's a primary belligerent in this genocide. It's playing a direct role in actually carrying it out. Obviously, there are U.S. citizens who are on the ground. There are generals, to kind of bring it back to the point about why the U.S. is so interested in this. There's several reasons. Obviously, it's to destabilize the region, to project U.S. power. Israel is not just a client state. I think it's a project of the United States at this point. It would not exist if the United States pulled its funding tomorrow. It would just cease to exist as a project. It would not survive. So in many instances, I would just say that that's clear evidence that this is a genocide that is being waged by the United States as either a co-belligerent or the primary belligerent. Obviously that implicates it, but then it also raises the question about intervention. Who's going to stop this? No genocide in history has ever stopped without I should say modern genocide. Because, obviously genocides against indigenous nations never stopped. Nobody intervened. There was no military intervention in many of them. But this current genocide, other genocides, like in more recent memory, will not stop without military intervention. So it begs the question, what will happen? And so far, Yemen is the only state that is actively trying to prevent and stop the genocide with its actions. You can make the argument that perhaps Iran is too, but you know, Israel was in direct conflict with Iran, and there's a cessation of hostilities, at least direct hostilities, maybe not indirect hostilities, and acts of war. But nonetheless, like those are the only two kind of instances in which you can probably make the argument there's been a direct intervention. Meanwhile, just about every nation, even those in the global south, are still have still normalized relations with Israel. There are some nations who are moving towards arms embargo, etc., but I haven't seen or read about anyone actually engaging or proposing to engage in military hostilities or a military campaign to stop this particular genocide, let alone the United Nations, right? I think the United States is very much interested in how Israel has been prosecuting this war and the legal justifications it has for a high civilian casualty count. There were several articles that came out, by military people around being embedded in this with the IDF in Gaza specifically to document the destruction of civilian infrastructure, not because they were interested in sort of documenting war crimes, but because they believe that the United States needs to change its wartime strategy or revamp or revolutionize its wartime strategy outside or moving beyond the U.S. war on terror tactics, which kind of focuses more on drone strikes, targeted missile or quote unquote precision missile strikes, etc., targeted assassinations, and going back to like full scale war mode because they're anticipating a potentially large conflict with China, which would result in obviously large civilian casualties. These military people think that China will be the bearer of those casualties. It remains to be seen. But the war footing in the United States and people like Pete Hegseth are actually looking at this particular genocide and sort of drawing inspiration about how we can rewrite the rules of engagement. They see it as kind of returning to traditional war, like going back to like World War II when there were high civilian casualties. I don't think they were as high as they are in this particular war. At least for on the side of the Allies, obviously Nazi Germany targeted civilian populations, etc. But I think that's a definite cause for concern when looking at this. The other kind of component of it, and this is like the summary of my argument, is that Israel has pushed the envelope. It has taken what is taboo, that is ritual human sacrifice, and normalized it, because so far the world has not intervened to stop it. By ritual human sacrifice, I mean actual ritual human sacrifice. Like, this is a ritual of killing. This is a ritual of slaughter. It's a religious ceremony. It's grounded within sort of biblical texts that are being cited. These are human beings. I mean, even when, it's surprising to me that they even call them human animals, because they're actually acknowledging that they're human, or human shields. So these are human beings. And the sacrifice is to show, the rest of the world that this is what happens when you stand up to empire. I think we often think of like something like ritual human sacrifice as something that is irrational, that is, going back to ancient times when people held irrational beliefs about the world and gods, and were superstitious, and we're supposedly moving beyond that. But this demonstrates that we have not moved beyond it, and then in fact we've normalized it. Even if you're opposed to this genocide, we've normalized it because the states and the locations and the regions that we live in, we have not moved anyone to stop it. So in that sense, this kind of culture war of getting us to accept the most taboo thing, which would be ritual human sacrifice. What's above that? Perhaps ritual child sacrifice. which we're also seeing. And this is something that I'm kind of like cribbing from a Chinese professor named Professor Jiang, who has a series on secret history on YouTube. He kind of brought this up. I disagree a little bit with this framing, and I'm actually adding a little bit of my own framing, because I don't think that this is kind of like senseless and irrational violence. I think it's very productive violence. It shows the world that this is what happens when you stand up to empire, that we will sacrifice your children. I don't really believe that Israelis believe that, especially the secular ones, believe that they are bringing about the end times by committing this kind of biblical genocide. I just think that they see a kind of political and social value in doing this genocide. At some point, they've gotten the world to accept it and to normalize it to the point where like you can't even it's illegal to talk about it basically in the United States as it exists, right? It's really warped the minds of the West to degrees that I could not imagine. I think 9/11 was like a watershed moment for me, and the immense amount of violence that the United States unleashed on that region, where millions of people were killed, as a result of this, supposed revenge for the 9/11 attacks. Like I never thought that we could be back in this moment, but I would actually say that we're actually in a more dangerous moment, because this war has spread beyond this particular region, and it's largely seen as a stepping stone to a larger great power confrontation, with China, with people at the helm, who are like encircling places like Venezuela, who are just wantonly killing people in boats that they can claim are drug traffickers, right? With no evidence. I mean, they did this with the war on terror. I can get into some of the legal justifications later in a different episode. I actually wrote a paper on this that will be published, hopefully, in Middle East Critique by December. But the justification that they're used, just to summarize my paper, the justification that they're using is that the United States is engaged in acts of war, but it has never formally declared war on Iran, or on Palestine, or on Yemen, or on Venezuela. But it doesn't need to, because its war power is derived from the wars that it has waged, against American Indian people in its Indian wars. So we have to look at those sort of models as examples, because that's what the Office of Legal Counsel, which is kind of like the Supreme Court of the executive branch. Those are the examples that they're using is the Indian wars. These presidents didn't declare war on Indian nations, but they still had war powers to enact forms of genocide. So that's where it leaves us in this moment. But I do think we are seeing, because Israel has not offered the world a sort of positive social alternative. It's actually offering the opposite. It needs to stretch our boundaries of what we consider taboo and impossible by committing ritual human sacrifice and ritual child sacrifice. I don't know how much further in the depths you can get, and the horrors you can commit, because every act that you think dehumanizes your enemy has actually dehumanized Israeli society to a point where I don't know what that leaves, and I don't really care what that leaves for Israelis. I'm more interested in how do we actually stop this. But I also see it as a sign of weakness, because the weak attack who they perceive as weaker than them. And what we've seen thus far, even despite the genocide, there's still an active resistance in Palestine. There is still, potential acts for peace and justice in the United States, despite all the political violence that we have going on. And by political violence, I'm not talking about the assassination of right-wing white supremacists. I'm talking about the mass killings at schools, the shootings, that is also a ritual human sacrifice, to a different degree and different flavor. But that what is happening in Palestine is not far removed from the culture that has been embedded in the United States since its inception. But I don't want to leave on a sad note, but I don't think the United Nations, I think in some ways we might be seeing the end of the legitimacy of the United Nations if that hadn't already happened already. But in many people's minds, I think this report is useful in many ways because it gives us the ammunition we need to perhaps in our own spheres of influence silence the critics of genocide. But I think it's a little too late for that. And you're leaving fewer and fewer political options for people in terms of stopping this. And those, that can only lead to desperation. But with that, I'll just leave it there. Thank you for listening. I'm also doing work over at Red Scare, which is, my Substack. It's nickestes.substack.com. We're doing a series on Capital Volume 1 by Marx. You can check it out. It's called Pod Capital. Sign up there. Thank you for subscribing to the Red Nation podcast. Be safe out there. Create your communities of care, but also, use this anger to help create clarity within your mind about what actually needs to be done to stop this.